All right, guys. So we're here with Philip SAYCE and Jesse Davey. Those guys are safe, keeping hunkered down in Los Angeles. Two guys that I look up to, two guys that I admire, and now two guys that I can honestly call good friends. So thank you guys for being here.
Cool. Good to speak to you.
So we're going to talk about SRV tone. Clearly, we are well aware that what he did and what he was able to do, and the power and the soul he put in every note, and that'll never be replicated. Much like Jimi Hendrix, Eric Clapton, all of those greats. There's a certain thing that those guys possess, and it's shared with us. But I think that you guys especially, I was drawn to you guys as being such a huge Stevie Ray Vaughan fan. The amount of attention I've heard you put into trying to capture some of that tone. So I want to talk a little bit about that if we could.
Cool.
All right. So
Yeah.
first off, man, what was it? When did you guys hear Stevie Ray Vaughan and that tone?
Yeah, go ahead, Jesse. What are you saying?
Well, the first time I actually heard Stevie was we were going on holiday in England, and we just normally went camping, and someone lent me a bunch of Stevie tapes on cassette. Someone had just copied the albums for me and put them on cassette at my little cassette player, and I literally listened the whole time. The whole time we were on holiday, I just had my headphones on, just listening. And it's actually that night we got home, literally within 10 minutes of getting home on the radio, they had announced his death. So it was a kind of a weird kind of introduction and kind of shock of hearing about that. But I was just totally mesmerized by the playing and tone. It was just, totally caught me.
I mean, Jesse, I totally hear you, right? Just about the idea of feeling totally overwhelmed with the first time experiencing, Stevie's energy through the recordings or through video. And, I remember hearing, my parents play some of Stevie's music in the house. And so I remember hearing Couldn't Stand the Weather as part of like a program my dad had recorded called Guitar Heroes. And so, it went through all these different players, all different genres. And Stevie's recording on there was Couldn't Stand the Weather. And so I used to dance around the house with a tennis racket and pretend I was playing the solo from Couldn't Stand the Weather. But I remember that really resonating. And then certainly my dad bringing home the Instep record and ultimately really telling me that, this is the dude, this is the top of the mountain. And there's obviously nobody being better than anybody else, but this is one of the greats to ever live. And so, yeah, it was just part of my upbringing, hearing his music.
He was still alive when I heard about him and stuff like that. And it was accessible, and it just drove me crazy hearing that stuff. And I loved music and I loved guitar, but I wasn't a guitar player, but it was that sound. I always thought he was playing underwater. Everything was so liquid and fluid,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
When you're starting out playing now, obviously it's no secret that Stevie is a major part in our lives. When you're starting out and you're starting to play, and what type of gear are you acquiring at a young novice age, trying to go for some of those things? What would you guys, what were you gravitating towards?
For me, it was an acoustic guitar, first of all, and it was the hardest acoustic guitar to play possibly in the world. And so, it just, for the first couple of years, just listening to all of those Stevie Ray Vaughan releases and amongst a lot of other people that I learned about through Stevie's just ability to bring people together and to take the light that was being shone on him and say, well, I'm glad you like what I'm doing. Look at Albert Collins. I'm glad you like what I'm doing, but let's check out Buddy Guy. Yeah. And then learning about some of those musicians more so than maybe anybody else that I can think of that had the light shone on them. But in terms of the equipment, yeah, it was just, okay, get a guitar and try to pick one note out at a time, then maybe two notes at a time, and eventually graduate to an electric guitar. But it was a long time on a guitar that was very, very difficult to play. Yeah.
Yeah, I agree totally. And as you're talking about gear, we didn't have a lot of money when I started, so I would just get my hands on anything. And I think to begin with, there's almost the question is more better, So I would get to the stage where I'd get like 5 amps and rig them all up together and sort of. But I think that I certainly learned that it was quality over quantity. I mean, if you can get both, then amazing. But
Yeah.
so I was just buying the cheapest amps I could find, and a lot of them didn't work. And I think that's why I ended up learning how to repair amps, just because I couldn't afford to pay anyone to fix them. So I would just, like equivalent to Craigslist, just go and buy these old Sound City amps, which they're probably almost valuable now, but back then I'd get them for like $30 to $20, and fix them up, and yeah, just really experiment with what I could. I didn't get hold of like a super reverb until much later on, and I wish I had, because I think in a lot of ways that's kind of almost like one of the key pieces in that chain, that link of tone. The super reverb is definitely part of that.
I feel, I mean, I'm looking at mine right now, but I know, Phil, that's, to me, a super, like when somebody says what amp for, I think with a super reverb, you can pretty much cover a lot of it, with some certain tweaks, I feel, because a stock super reverb, it's going to get you 80% of that stuff, but it'll fall down on itself. The classic, yeah, it sounds really good. It's not making any more noise, because they detonate. But super reverb, I think, when I got a reissue and I was like, I got a super reverb, and then I heard like a real blackface one that was a good one with some better speakers, and I was like, oh man, there's nothing. I got to get one of those now. So that, I think that's how like that progression starts, is you hear this brand overdrive, but then you hear that one and you're like, oh, that's way closer. And then you hear this wah wah or something, and then you hear that another one, and that's way better. And you just do this kind of process of elimination. It ends up working for you. And each of you can answer this. If you were gonna not build a dream rig, but if you were gonna go to you were gonna buy a couple of old amps and build an SRV setup, and obviously a lot of it is in the hands and the heart. But if you were going to put together a setup with current gear that's not astronomical dumble prices, what would you have in the pile?
Yeah, go ahead, Jesse. What are your thoughts?
Well,
chime in. Don't be afraid. It's Sunday.
Yeah. I actually am a big fan of the 70s amps. So if you don't have a lot of money, I actually love the Fender Twins. I think they're the speakers that they normally shipped with, which were the JBL orange speakers, super harsh and hard, and I certainly really struggled with them. But as soon as I put different speakers in those old Fenders, I just think they're incredible, and I actually possibly favor them over a super reverb, actually, because there's a little bit more sort of chunk to it. But I think if I could pick any amps, I mean, I love the Two Rock amps. I think they have that super reverb thing going on, but they have all that low end that the super reverb just doesn't have. So a dream rig would probably be Fender Vibratone, because once you've used one of those, exactly one of those. Once you've used one of those, it's hard to take it out of the rig. Yep. I mean, I've done gigs where there hasn't been a lot of space, and I've had to kind of take it out, and it just adds something. I mean, that's another key to Stevie's tone, I think, is that sort of swirly tone. And I guess it also, the way you mic it up means it naturally gives you a certain sort of boxy ambience to the tone. So it would probably be something like a Two Rock, a Fender Twin, or a Fender Quad, which is like a 4-speaker version of that. And the Vibratone, the Two Rock Vibratone and Fender Quad. Dream setup.
What about you?
That's monstrous. Yeah, that would be a monstrous rig. And Jesse, I have to say, like, having seen you play live in different settings, I mean, yeah, the sound that you've been able to set up in a live setting is fantastic.
Thank you.
Hearing your sound, certainly watching from side stage, maybe where I think that might have been in Belgium or something. I can't remember where we both.
Yeah, I remember that show. Yeah.
But that was, I mean, amazing sound. And, Nick, of course, too. I mean, all the tones that I'm hearing you getting are outstanding. I mean, it's great. Always very, very inspiring. And so I think, a lot of times to try to find something, like that is that refined, it's hard. I think a lot of times if you're starting from scratch, let's say if you're flying into a gig, right? You're going somewhere and you have a gig. In a lot of ways, it's sort of like starting from zero, because, you might request, well, I'd like to have this amp and that amp, and you show up and there's none of those there.
Yeah.
Nick, I remember well when we were in Texas at the Dallas show, and they had every amp in the world there, like every amp from A to Z, every boutique amp. And I got on the stage.
They pulled out a Blues Junior.
Oh yeah, a Twin and a Blues Junior, and the Twin was broken. And the guy goes, "Ladies and gentlemen, would you please welcome?" And I'm looking, I got no amp. What am I going to do? And so, well, there's a Blues. What was it? What was it? A Blues Junior?
It was a Blues. You ended up using a Blues Junior and a Hot Rod Deluxe, and just I can remember that moment. I laughed because you just were like, "Well, fuck it," and you did that, and you went chunk, chunk, chunk. And the irony of it is, behind you were two Eric Johnson's, two full stacks, two twin reverbs stacked up on each other. And you were like, well, we looked at that and we kind of had a laugh, and you were like, fuck it, let's do it. And you just, boom, you know?
And so what I'm trying to get at is that sometimes, you know, if you don't have the choice, you know, to pick, you know, something, and you just got to go on the fly and grab something quick, I think it's a reissue Twin. I really do. And I think if you want to get louder, it's two of them. And you just, you know, and I think, and really that's just sort of like a Band-Aid measure. Like if you're there, there's what is the most common amplifier that I'm going to be able to backline in this situation? Like they're probably not going to have a 2-rock. They probably wouldn't have a, you know, one of these amps that are, you know, really well made with all these things we're talking about. So yeah, probably a reissue Twin, and just put that thing on 10. Yeah. It's just say that this is going to be the last gig that Twin's going to play. And yeah, that would maybe be my approach.
The great part with the Twins too is that moment where all of a sudden it starts kind of doing like that high pitch, and then you look back at the pilot light and it's doing the and then boom, and then thanks guys, good night. Yeah, you know, because they've just detonated, you know, and they blow up pretty cool when they blow up,
but they're not.
Sorry.
I think you touched on something there, Philip, is that turning the amps up is such a key to getting a tone out of an amp. But you'll probably feel the same as you know, an amp set on a really low volume, an amp set on 3 or 4, in a way might as well be a transistor amp. You're not getting what a tube can do for you at that volume. It's not really doing much. So I think you're right. Just cranking it up, even whatever it is, can often give you some of what you want.
Hopefully, yeah.
Well, yeah. So this segues into the next thing, which is great. Is what was the, you know, as time has gone on and you guys are tone hunting and seeking stuff out, what was the aha moment as far as, okay, that needs to happen from now on? For me, I can totally 100% say putting the amp on 7, like a super reverb, putting it on 7. And I try to explain this to everybody, because once you have an amp like that on 7, yes, it's loud, but the amp finally does the work for you. You're not trying to do the work for the amp. You have the freedom to hold a note, let a note sing, because the amp is cooking, the tubes are saturating, and it's working for you. A super reverb on 2 or 3 in your bedroom is not going to give you what you're looking for. You know, with volume comes a lot of natural low end, and you can turn the bass down when an amp is pushed that hard. Mm-hmm. And now you kind of get that tight sound that he had, you know, and that's what I mean. My super reverb is on 7 right now, just sitting here. You might as well glue the knob, because that's where it stays. So I mean, that was my, you know, and I'm not speaking for anybody, but I know leaving a deluxe 22-watt deluxe reverb, put it on 7, let the amp do the work for you, you know. And that was, I think
there is a kind of a magic point on an amp, and you can hear it too far and it kind of goes slightly flabby and you kind of lose clarity, and too low, you can kind of hear it as you turn that volume up. You can kind of hear this point where it breaks up a bit. Again, you don't want it, in my opinion, you don't want it too broken up, but it's like that magic point where it's broken up a bit, but it'll still take a pedal. So if you're kicking in something like a Tube Screamer, it'll still give you that extra bit. So if it's too cranked, you find that you start using pedals that it can be mushy. So it's like that magic, you know, like you say, on 7, but some amps it might be 10. Some amps, you know, like a Fender Twin unmodded, even on 10, it can be a bit too clean. I don't know if you found that, but
that's the Twins are the only amps I find myself putting bass on, just to get them to kind of flub up a little bit, you know, right, to get to do that thing. You know what I'm talking about in New York. That we used a twin at that show at the 118. Was that it?
Yeah. That was in outside Philadelphia.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh
Yeah, that
yeah, they
was
made a big deal. Oh, this is a perfect twin. You this is yeah, oh yeah.
so. Any other of those moments, or any other in your findings when you guys were modding or tone hunting, or actually, Philip, if you could touch on a little bit, and I know this is very personal to you, so you can be tight-lipped about it, but you got to actually spend quite a bit of time with Cesar Diaz, who is famed for working with Stevie and Bob Dylan, Keith Richards, all those heroes, Clapton, everybody. I mean, you got to spend some time with Caesar. Is there anything that not giving away any secrets, but anything that you picked up that kind of helped you in your tone quest?
Yeah, I mean, Caesar, I first reached out to Cesar Diaz. At the time, I was working with Jeff Healy, and, we had like Vintage Guitar Magazine, and we had, these things. And so I would see Diaz ads, and, of course, I gravitated towards Caesar because he worked with Stevie. And
Yeah.
I'd read the interviews, like all the stuff that we've all seen. And he wasn't that far. I was living in Toronto. He was in the Poconos. So it was about a 5 or 6 hour drive from Toronto. But the first time I called him, I was working with Jeff, and I just said, hey, I picked up the phone and called him. He answered. I'm like, hey, I'm Philip. I'm touring. I would love to get a fuzz pedal. We talked for quite some time on the phone. He was a super gentleman, told me how to use the Squareface. And so then the next time I called him, we were in Chicago, and I just said, hey, I'm having amp problems. He said, great, send me your amp. And so that was a dual Showman reverb that I sent to him, which came back and is, I think to this day, the best amp I've ever heard. It was crazy. I don't know what he did, but it was crazy. And then a little bit after that, I got in the car, brought a few amps with me, drove down to his house and slept over. His family put me up, and they were just the nicest people. And I think really, like, Caesar taught me a lot. Like, I had my vintage fuzz face, I had this and that, and he built me a pedal. And he goes, okay, let's hear this pedal, and then let's hear your fuzz face. He goes, and it was very clear. The fuzz face was kind of like, yeah, it's good. The pedal he made was great. And he just said, what are you doing with that piece of shit? Get that out of here. Like, what do you need that for? And it's like, listen with your ears, listen to what you're doing. Don't just do this because everybody else did it. So he really was about, yeah, listen and play what feels right for you. Listen and yeah, he was he was like he was a top dude, and he was a really nice guy, and just an insight, like a wealth of knowledge. I mean, he was like a master chef. So I'm grateful for the time I spent with him.
So Jesse, obviously you with your company, King Tone Guitar, you've taken what you've learned over the years and kind of built this, I don't know, this array of just iconic pedals so far. In the last few years, your name and your pedals are everywhere. So not only hats off to you, but what were some of those mods you maybe want to share with some people that you started picking up that really kind of bumped your chase for the SRV tone, like certain setups or certain things you kind of worked out and you were like, this is a must have if you're going for that? What are some things you may want to
You mean like amp mods?
or guitar setup or
Well, I think, yeah, I mean, we toured Europe, obviously, from the UK, so we toured Europe a lot, and we got to meet a lot of the people who either were promoters for Stevie when he came and played in Europe, or even engineers who worked with him. Now, I can't verify if this story is true, but I spoke to the German promoter, and he was apparently at the Rock Palace show, and he was talking, and again, I can't verify if this is true, but he went into a lot of detail about there being a back room with amps in it, mic'd up ambiently. And of course, this for me, I was like, wow, that's incredible. Of course, in a studio situation, that's what you would do. In a studio, you don't put a mic right in front of a speaker because it doesn't sound. I mean, no one, listens to an amp with their ear in front of a speaker. It's a guitar tone is obviously partly about the speaker, partly about the vibration of the cabinet, and very much about the room that it's in. So all of those things make a difference. So I think that, and I've actually heard stories from quite a few people that there was a gig we did in New York where the engineer said Stevie backed his van up to the gig and put an amp in the back of the van. I think he put his Leslie in the back of the van and mic'd it up out there. So that actually gave me a lot of ideas.
Yeah,
The ideas of trying to capture more of a studio sound live. Obviously, it doesn't really, if you're playing like a club date, it doesn't really matter because you're already in the room. So you've got that. But some of the larger stages where it can be, really lack a lot of ambience and a lot of sort of vibe about it. And so so one thing I started doing a lot in the band was finding a back room and putting an amp in it. And it would just add that little bit of ambience, a little bit of resonance to the sound. So when it goes through the PA, it sounds a little bit more like a studio recording rather than just like those close mics on a speaker that can sound really quite unpleasant sometimes. So that was definitely something I picked up for sure.
I had a family member who opened for Stevie a bunch in 1987, and he said that under the stage there were he said they were basements. I don't know if they were basements in 87, but there were 4 basements pointed up at the stage while he was playing, and they were miking it down there as well. And the first time I saw it, Philip, the first time I saw you at Molly Malone's, you had an amp on stage and an amp in the back room as well. You kind of did something like that. I don't know if I wasn't supposed to give that away.
Well, no, it was either that or no gig, right? It's like you can only bring in so many amps onto the stage, and when you overpower the front of house, like when the guitar is louder than the entire PA, and we've all been to shows like that. It's kind of like it's not as enjoyable experience for the people that have come to the show when you can't hear the vocals or the drums or anything else. All you hear is just like just guitar. So a lot of times, we would start putting maybe break it down to 1 or 2 amps on stage and then have one in the back somewhere, have it mic'd, just as Jesse was saying, for that kind of quality of sound or attempt at quality of sound. Certainly, depending on if you're traveling with your own front of house person, that you can really develop those nuances and kind of really, even though you're in a different room each night, dial it in and sort of have a plan on like how are we going to deal with the volume situation here, and so. So that was Nick. That was really why that one ended up back there. Same at other clubs, like smaller clubs, like Hotel Cafe. I know we tucked one under the stage, but that's more of a singer-songwriter room, and I don't know if it was the right fit for what we were doing. So,
well, the cool part of that is, because we had already been friends at that point, so I was kind of free to roam. When you can stand back there and listen to the cab doing its thing and hear you're playing with the band kind of muffled. It's really a wild experience because you're just hearing like an isolated track almost, like you're hearing yourself isolated playing. So you really can say, well, my buddy Philip can he's all right on that guitar. But not only that, it's the sound is there, and there's a really, really great tone that comes from that, and it's just inspiring to hear. Like even at that power, at that level, at that headroom, and at that push, it still sounds beautiful, even though your ears are bleeding in a way, So thank you for what?
Yeah. Remember gigs? Oh man,
It'd be cool to see one eventually. You guys want to talk about maybe guitar setup having something to do with some of that tone?
Yes, sir.
I am a high action person and a large fret person. I don't know about you guys, but 100% higher action and large frets, I feel, kind of give you that air around the note kind of feel. And it almost makes it easier to play in a way. People may look at that and maybe kind of like an oxymoron, but I don't know. What can you say about guitar setup that may help with some of those tones? We'll go with Jesse first because.
Yeah, I mean, I know we were talking about this the other day, but I think, a great tone. It doesn't matter if it's a sort of Stevie Ray tone or or whatever type of tone you're getting. But I think it's always going to be a chain, and each little thing you do is a link in that chain. And you can still get a tone with a few broken links, but the idea is to fix all of those links, and you get a great tone no matter what you're after. And I don't know if Philip agrees with this, but for me, I would say putting the action high, regardless of fret size. Putting the action high is probably for me number one. it's almost impossible to get any tones really, unless it's a very, very distorted tone. Any sort of attack and dynamics from a sound with a low action. So I think, and it's in a way basic physics, because if you fret a note and play a string, that fret immediately after it is going to stop the vibration of that string. So if you have a low action, that fret gets so close, that fret after the one you're fretting gets so close, it stops the vibration of the note, almost compresses it. So it's about getting the action up, and it's not like infinitely up. It doesn't matter. You don't have to go crazy on it, but there's a point where the note just fattens up, and you get a lot of dynamics, a lot of response from the note. And so, for me, number one would be action high for sure.
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't really have too much to add to that, Jesse. I mean, I agree with you, and I think there is something about getting strings up in the air a little bit. It just creates all of what you just talked about. So both you guys, and I agree with you both. One thing I would say is that, it's really important to listen to your body. And so while it looks good on Instagram and it's good to tell everybody like, hey, I'm playing 13s and look at my action, it's crazy. I think one thing that, we don't hear a lot of people talk about are injuries. And I think it's also really important to understand that Stevie Ray Vaughan, who we're really talking about here, somebody who's not only brought us together, but somebody who I feel was really ahead of his time. He's sort of timeless, but his physical capabilities are also different from anybody I've ever met who plays the guitar. To play with that type of control, that type of ferocity, that type of like he could be gentle, he could be strong, and everything in between. This just was comfortable to him. And so I think, one of the things that I certainly learned, starting and going, okay, well, I guess I got to get 13s on my guitar and crank the action way up. And here I am, and, and I'm going for it. And, what? Like, I've totally hurt myself now. Like, I'm not saying literally, but, I'm in my bedroom, I'm playing for 6 months. I don't, know anything about refretting. I don't know about any of this. And now I'm in trouble, really. So I think that's also part of it. No one ever told me like, hey, you can get hurt playing, that like you can get hurt by playing strings that are too big for who you are. Like, so I think there's also part of it, like, that needs to also be thought of. Like when we're saying, and I don't speak for either of you guys, but I think, just like when we say like put the strings up, I think it's like within reason. So it's still comfortable to play and you're not hurting yourself. That's really I think that's the place. Because for Stevie, and I have a friend, good friend, Corey, who told me about the time he played Stevie's number one backstage at Albert's Hall in Toronto. And Corey is a lifelong guitar player, excellent guitar player. He's hung out with all the cats. He knows what's up. He said in the dressing room, he picked up number one, beautiful. He said he couldn't fret a note. Strings are so high up with giant. He's just like, what the fuck is this? Right? Well, then Stevie grabs and goes, bam, two-step bend, huge vibratos, no problem. So I think it's just kind of like remembering the physical, what's natural for Michael Jordan versus what's natural for LeBron James. These are two brilliant players, but different physical set, so anyway, this is kind of off topic a little bit.
No.
But I do think it's important to be aware that with heavy strings and high action, it's very demanding on the hands.
Yeah, I feel like this might seem really obvious, but and I think that as long as you prioritize it right, I think obviously playing guitar is about music. It's about creating music and it's about moving people. It's not a sport. It's not necessarily about playing fast. So it's finding that compromise where probably a good tone is probably more important than easy to play, because if you've got a good tone, people are going to want to listen. So I think it's about finding that compromise. Like you say, I did the 13 gauge strings. I'm just not built for that. I'm just not built for. I did use 13 gauge strings for maybe a year or something, and it was so limiting that it I'm just not built like Stevie. Stevie, like, I don't know how Stevie did it. I mean, I had the 13 strings with his thin gauge. I've heard like other stories. So I think as long as you prioritize, you're making music first, and you put the action up and use a string gauge that is practical and sounds great, and It's about finding that thing where you can still play kind of what you want to play, but for me, it would be prioritize the sound, just because you're trying to communicate with other people listening. So if it sounds good, they're more likely to listen. Hopefully.
Yeah.
Hopefully, right? I just, in regards of him, I found, like, when hunting those sounds, definitely getting the action up a little bit and having that air under there, and there's a little more clarity that comes when the action comes up. And I'm not saying, you know, like, Jesse, your action is every time I go over your house with a guitar, you're like, oh, let me just, and then I have to, like, learn all over again. I just raised it a little, you know, but there is a clarity, I feel, that comes from a higher action, and I think that with him, that I think you're hearing a clarity in the note, you know. And again, high action, then you start introducing things like lowering pickups down, not bringing pickups up so high, amps turned way up, lower pickups, higher action. Now you're allowed to push those amps and play through that stuff and get kind of some of that non-flubby organic sound. I think it's a lot of research, and it just doesn't, you don't just pull a guitar out of the bag and go, all right, this is supposed to sound like this, you know. I don't think that Stevie was necessarily you know, a tinkerer at a lot, you know, judging by, he was a tone guy. He knew when his tone was off, but I don't think he was sitting there, you know, getting every adjustment he could out of pickups. I think he found something and it stayed that way. I remember reading a story one time where his relief in his neck was just so bad. It was like so curved, and somebody was like, we can straighten that out for you. And he's like, oh, no, that's how I like it. That's how I play it. And he was like, but he's like, no, that's how I want it.
I think what Stevie had was just the most incredible ears. I think that's what he had. He knew when something sounded good or when it sounded wrong.